Thanks for joining me today, Mr. David.
Hello, Cory. Thanks for having me.
So, I guess just to give some background, people have heard of the Phoenix system. I read most of the book. I didn't get all the way through it quite yet, but part of it was, it wasn't even originally called the Phoenix system, but there was a big change that was happening kind of a little bit before Stephen Harper, and then it came in during Stephen Harper's time. This is one that I don't even want to point at specific parties because it's had multiple parties in charge, and this disaster has kept rolling along. Give a bit of background, though. What happened? How did we get into this mess?
It's a great question. We should talk about how the mess began, and then let's talk about when it blew up. And so let me explain first the word phoenix. The mythical phoenix is reborn from its ashes. So we need to ask, from which ashes was this Phoenix project supposed to rise? And here's a quick history. A core operation of our federal government is to pay the public servants. And you would think that having to issue paychecks every 2 weeks, that they would be good at it by now. They're not. And so by Mulroney's term in office, it was apparent that our government had cobbled together a bunch of IT systems. It was difficult to maintain, difficult to keep up to date. And so in the last weeks of his term, and when power was transitioning over to Kim Campbell, his government signed a $45 million contract with Accenture. The goal of that contract was to modernize the pension systems and the pay systems of the federal government. Now, of course, we know Kim Campbell didn't win that election. Jean Chrétien won that election. And immediately he terminated the contract. And so nothing but ashes, Accenture took us to court, or took the federal government to court. There was a settlement. The Canadian public doesn't know the details of that settlement, but litigation took a decade. And so 10 years later, now we're talking 2004, 5, 6, the senior bureaucrats had renewed interest in the project. They estimated it would cost about $6 million, but the scope of it continued to increase. Stephen Harper's government then was persuaded to spend about $300 million to replace the payroll systems and to centralize the payroll staff into one single office. That's how the mess began.
So, we'll cover some more of the details in between, but fast forward to today, some of the estimates on what this has cost is getting into $4 billion. When you started at $6 million, you got up to a few hundred million, and now we're up to $4 billion. And that's just the taxpayers' cost. And then hundreds of thousands of payments over the years have been messed up. Some people have been overpaid, some have been underpaid, some have been paid at all. That's a cost that we can't even begin to measure. Is the bleeding stemming at all yet?
Not at all. And so let's go back to 2016 for a minute. Justin Trudeau's government greenlighted the launch of the project. Phoenix had been delayed a number of times under Stephen Harper's government. Everyone knew it wasn't ready, and no one was ready to launch it. Justin Trudeau was elected, and MP Judy Foote was given this file, and then her and her senior advisors agreed to launch the system in March 9 of 2016. So the system at that time was used to calculate the paychecks of about 120,000 of the roughly 200,000 public servants at the time. 40,000 of those paychecks in that first pay run were incorrect. And so your question is, are we still hemorrhaging money? And yes, we are. We're throwing money at this ever since. The error rate today, the backlog of corrections that need to be made today, is as large as it was in 2016. So as of today, 408,000 payroll errors await resolution. And every 2 weeks, there are more errors. They fix some. There are more errors. They fix some. There are more errors. It's been a disaster ever since 2016.
Yeah, and we saw it was frustrating to read it for people familiar with Yes Minister. It's an English sitcom about a minister getting snowed by his bureaucrats who were talking to him when things would fail and so on, and they would double speak. But some of those committee meetings, when they would talk to some of the asking about this, they just couldn't get any straight answers out of the senior bureaucrats on it. And I believe it was Foote who said at one point that she called it a success in the first little bit of a run. How could you have such a massive error rate and call it a success?
Yeah, it's amazing the doublethink that you can read into the committee minutes. So I wrote the book. Your question earlier was about costs. I wrote the book just over a year ago. I calculated that the taxpayer had already spent $4.2 billion, and I should qualify that number. And I actually think journalists should really dig in and debate these numbers more deliberately. So first, most journalists go with the government's own estimates, 3.2 or 3.5 billion. But those numbers include the direct costs and the large settlement that was paid out to the union members, but they exclude the costs associated with replacing the Phoenix system, and there's a huge number of projects underway in that regard, and they exclude, and this is where my unique expertise was helpful. I looked at the full list of ongoing large IT projects, and I found numerous integration projects. And so, for example, $33 million was spent to integrate the systems at CBSA, CRA, Parks Canada, RCMP. This money is spent only because Phoenix exists and only because its capabilities are so incompatible with the needs of those departments. And so if we include all of those integration projects, as of a year ago, I calculated $4.2 billion had gone through this inferno.
Yeah, and I mean it sounds like there's work being done. I started looking and digging because we do hear about it periodically erupts, but it never seems to get solved. They're going to replace it with something called Dayforce, or they're easing into that system now. Do you think they're going to be more careful? It sounds like they're going to phase it in rather than try, because something that large, you can't just flick a switch and change systems. You do have to try to integrate it, but at the same time, they're trying to fix 500,000 other errors that they still have built up.
Yeah, good point. So they are taking a more incremental approach, I think, with this new initiative. However, Cory, where there's smoke, there's fire. Dayforce, it used to be called Ceridian. They won the contract to replace Phoenix, and there's virtually nothing known about their involvement, or McKinsey's. So we can see those two companies show up in some committee minutes, but you go to the website, you find for projects or RFPs or line items in the annual budget, and there's very little to discover there. I think there are many questions. For example, why did Navdeep Bains step down? Why did Navdeep Bains' chief of staff suddenly become an executive at Dayforce? And why did the CEO of Dayforce tell reporters after the 2021 election, he told reporters that Justin Trudeau's cabinet had requested that Dayforce not publicize the fact that they had won the contract until after the election. It appears Justin Trudeau or one of his cabinet members specifically asked to keep that a secret during the campaign until after the election. Why was that? I think there's a lot of questions to be asked about their involvement and what's going on.
There always are, and people always have to be careful about it. When you get a government contract with that large amount of money and their history of bad controls on it, the opportunists are going to come out of the woodworks. It just happens. It's the way it goes. So, whether Dayforce is right or wrong, it's not unprecedented for an organization to have a payroll this large in modern times. We've got a workforce of about 420,000, which is really huge for civil service, but still, there are a lot of companies and governments and others who have payrolls as large or larger than this. And are they operating more successfully than us?
Well, if I could take a moment here, we need to do this differently. Issuing paychecks every 2 weeks to public servants is a core operation of the government, as you said. And we're talking about basic math and well-known accounting techniques. This kind of software is not magic. The business rules, while complicated, and there are 80 plus collective bargaining agreements, and that certainly makes things more difficult, but the requirements are known and programmable. So I believe, and so your question is, are others doing this better than the federal government of Canada? Well, some are. Some governments also have their own boondoggles. But I think it comes down to a simple question between lesser evils. The government could do this in-house. Certainly the taxpayer employs an army of IT professionals and software developers, and they could build a purpose-built tool to operate this core operation of the government. Or the government could continue to outsource this stuff to giant multinationals who supposedly have the expertise, but they continue to fail, and they repeatedly fail to deliver. So both of these options are ripe for waste and corruption. But we need to think back to 2005 and 6 and 7. What were the conditions of that time before Stephen Harper was persuaded to sign the approval of that first $300 million? Let's think back to that time. Many bureaucrats and MPs complained about the existing payroll systems. They were 40 years old. They were hard to maintain. And I don't doubt that. But let's remember that those systems were successfully conducting paychecks every 2 weeks for 190,000 employees. The error rate was very, very low, much lower than today's error rate with Phoenix. But the MPs latched on to this Phoenix myth. They were absolutely taken on faith and with no empirical evidence that the old systems just needed to be replaced, and that a commercial system, purchased from some multinational company was the way to replace them. Now, both of those ideas were the result of, I think, just a bandwagon effect. To your question, lots of other jurisdictions, they've tried the same. They've bought systems off the shelf. They call them COTS products, or commercial off-the-shelf products, and their mileage may vary, you might say. But our government is absolutely addicted to these giant IT replacement projects. Is the taxpayer just on the hook every 5 years to throw billions of dollars at the cronies of the day to replace these IT systems? I think we need to start asking these kinds of questions.
Absolutely. I mean, kind of a funny comment out of Mr. Stanley, but he's probably dead right. He says, I bet the Phoenix employees still receive their pay on time. Yeah, when you're inside, you can make sure that your check comes through. But and I'm kind of bouncing around, but I'll bounce back. I mean, something you mentioned in the book, and it's interesting, when politics gets mixed into things, that's usually when the trouble comes about. So one of the things Prime Minister Stephen Harper did in his time was getting rid of the old boondoggle of the Liberal gun registry. And part of that was they bought themselves Love and Mirror Machine, New Brunswick, by setting up the administration offices there. So now they had to lay off loads and loads of civil servants who were running this terribly inept gun registry. Harper thought he could kill two birds with one stone and said, well, we will re-employ them with this new payroll system. So they took those bureaucrats and just kind of shuffled them into something they weren't necessarily qualified to embrace, but it was a way to patch a hole and try and maintain a seat. It's this is just typical of governments, unfortunately.
Well, I think any other prime minister might have made the same calculation Stephen Harper did. If the goal was to centralize this operation into one office, there were just a few offices across the country that were suitable for this with available staff. So I don't begrudge his decision on that point, but it also is interesting to note that it takes about 2 years for the payroll staff to be properly trained so that they can conduct this work. Why does it take 2 years? Well, part of that is because the regulations are so complex. There are 80 and more collective bargaining agreements. The systems are difficult to use, and then they burn out. So of all the people that start the process to learn how to become a payroll advisor in our government, only about 40% of them continue the training. 2 years later, 60% of them have quit and left. And so that speaks to the difficulty of the job, but also the nightmare that is this work environment.
Well, yeah, and plus just the competency. I mean, if you have a high turnover, then you're not going to have offices with long-term experienced people to apply themselves to issues. But I guess if you're applying yourself and you can't fix anything, that's how you end up burnt out.
What's interesting, if I could add, Cory, to that point, the solutions, the best. So if we look at how the government has burned through the errors that have occurred, and we look at how have they done that most effectively, it's usually that a small group of experienced people have come together, they work together as a pod, and they burn through a backlog of errors and they fix them. The solution here is people, not some belief in some magical system that we can buy from a multinational corporation.
Well, there's not going to be any quick magic bullet, that's for sure. And I mean, that's part of why you've written a book on it. The time has run out quickly because it's such a big issue here. But I'm certain you're going to continue to watch this and be speaking on it. So where can people find your book, and where can they find you to keep up on what's going on as hopefully this government or the next government gets on to solving this issue so they can move on to solving many others?
Thanks, Cory, for that. They can find me at davidsabine.ca. And davidsabine.ca/Phoenix. That'll take you right to a page where you can look at the book. You can buy it at Amazon on paperback or Kindle version, or you can buy it at LeanPub as well. Find me on LinkedIn. I'm active there, and on X, I'd be happy to connect with people.
Great. Well, I thank you for taking the time to join us today and for watching this issue and digging into it. Like I said, some of these things seem kind of dry and they're bookkeeping sort of things and stuff like that. But boy, it's not so dry and unimportant when you're the one whose check hasn't shown up on time, or when you're working in a department that's spinning its wheels and burning you out. So
it's true. Some people have lost their savings, they've lost their homes. It's been a disaster all around. Really, I appreciate that you brought me on to talk about it.
Great. Well, we'll keep bringing it up and can't let them forget it. And hopefully, as I said, hopefully that problem gets solved, because there's many others for them to work on. So perhaps we'll talk again soon, and we'll be talking about a solution at that time.
Thank you, Cory.